Okay, Saar, take it away.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be presenting the case by Rootclaim. Our conclusion is lab leak, but as you will see throughout the presentation, we will actually be discussing both hypotheses because that's the way we work. We try to assess the evidence under both hypotheses and find which one is the strongest. It just happened that our conclusion is lab leak. I will be taking a few minutes to talk about how we work because that will pop up throughout my presentation. So what we try to do is to solve a major problem that many people recognize and are frustrated by, and that is you have intelligent people looking at the same evidence and claiming wildly contradictory conclusions. So origins of COVID is a great case. You have the former CDC chief and the current CDC chief on opposing sides. You have scientists claiming dispositive evidence, smoking guns in favor of one hypothesis or the other, which brings me back to what Peter said about thinking that peer-reviewed science is better than what we're doing here. I disagree. I think peer-reviewed science is great in bringing evidence and assessing it, but when you need to integrate from multiple disciplines, that's something that doesn't happen well in peer-reviewed science. That is a process we actually don't have today. That's what we hope we can be contributing to the world. And I think the process we're doing here is much more reliable in that sense. And last you see, oops, sorry. Okay. And last you see intelligence agencies of the U.S. disagreeing on this same issue. And again, that's very weird because they have the same evidence. They supposedly have very strong inference methods. And why are they getting different conclusions? Quickly, what we don't do fact-checking, we don't generate new evidence, we don't do leaks, we don't do investigative journalism, we don't try to conjecture when there's no evidence. What we do is when there is a lot of evidence, but experts and intelligent people look at it and just are not able to get to a conclusion. Why does this happen? I won't go over the whole thing here, but there are a few biases that we have when we're trying to deal with high uncertainty and multiple pieces of evidence. One thing we'll be talking shortly is about ignoring the prior probability. Other things are about looking at multiple evidence and understanding how they affect together the analysis. So some people will double count the same evidence, or in other cases they won't realize that a few pieces of evidence, even though each one of them is weak, together bring them to certainty, high certainty. So a lot of things that people struggle with when dealing with probability. That's why this doesn't happen. And that's what we try to solve by our methodology. So basically, this whole process you see here, I won't go over all of it. The idea is to be able to accurately quantify the strength of the evidence. And once you do that, it's very easy to feed it into probabilistic model. The model is proven. It's a formula. It's not about, there's no AI, no algorithms here. Once you agree about the numbers, there's only one solution, and that has been known for over a century. So a few things we do is we make sure to have all the evidence, all the hypotheses. We make sure to account for dependencies between the evidence. Something very, very important that we do is we always Thielman each hypothesis. Okay, we always try to find the best explanation for the evidence under each hypothesis, rather than attacking one evidence and supporting the other one, like most people do. We try to find what is the best way for each for each hypothesis to explain the evidence, and then we can quantify how these best explanations measure up, and then we can feed it into the formula and get get a result. Something else important that we do is we assess the reliability of our own estimates, kind of a sensitivity analysis. So we make sure to take ranges on every number we use and look at the high range and low range and see that we and see how that affects the confidence in our conclusions. I'm going to go quickly on two cases in which we went against what authorities' mainstream opinions were and were eventually proven correct. I will explain later how. One is a murder case, the most famous murder case in Israel. 13-year-old girl was found dead inside a locked bathroom stall in her school. This person, Roman Zadorov, who was a floor there, he was eventually convicted based on his confession, and we claimed another person as the murderer. The famous chemical attacks in 2013 next to Damascus. So hundreds of civilians dead from sarin gas. The entire Western governments, intelligence agencies, human rights organizations all placed blame on the government. We said it's the opposition, and as you'll see soon, we turned out to be correct in both of these cases. So something very interesting that I'll try to show is how we keep seeing the same patterns when authorities get conclusions wrong. Not necessarily authorities, but whenever you have intelligent people, sophisticated mechanisms reaching wrong conclusions, there are several things that you find happen every time. So I'll go a few of these cases and also show how we see the same fallacies, the same biases happening in the claim of zoonotic origin for COVID-19. So one thing we call trapped prior. It's not our name. It's the trapped prior is the name we like the best. It's somewhat similar to confirmation bias, and that is because we're not good. I mean, humans, we're not good in assessing multiple evidence. The way we usually approach the world is we latch into something that is easy for us to understand. That would be like the first evidence, and we would say, okay, this gives me an initial confidence in my hypothesis, and then I will examine evidence as it comes one by one. And each evidence I will examine, is it strong enough to contradict my anchor? If not, I will simply dismiss it as maybe it's fabricated, maybe it's an unreliable source. I will just throw away this evidence because it doesn't sit with my current hypothesis, and go evidence by evidence, throw away everything that is not strong enough to by itself convince me. And of course, evidence that supports, I will integrate and feel that it supports my analysis. And this could bring me to a position where I don't realize that all the evidence I looked through is already far more strong than my initial anchor, because each time I threw it one by one. Okay, so for example, in the murder case, we had a very common problem in the judicial system. Judges can't think why someone would confess to a crime he didn't commit. That's their anchor. And then they just try to see if there's anything that will very strongly overthrow the confession, when in fact we know today that confessions are very common. In fact, 25% of convictions that were overturned by DNA also had a confession in them. In COVID-19, the trapped prior, the anchor that people use is that most viruses come from zoonosis. So okay, so that will be our prior. We'll start with that. And then they evaluate the evidence in light of that assumption. But then what they forget is that we had in recent years advancement in gain-of-function research that greatly increased the pandemic risk, and we will look into that. Another thing that happens often is people will latch to some smoking gun, some evidence that they think is very strong, but in practice it's either fabricated or it's a sharpshooter fallacy, which we'll discuss in a minute. Basically, it's the concept that you match evidence from a large search space. So you cherry pick a few matches, but forget about all the mismatches. So, for example, in the murder case, we had an issue of a shoe print that was claimed to match the suspect, but the match was not obvious. It was based on picking 4 features in the shoe and finding 4 features on the jeans on the pants of the victim, and saying, okay, each of these 4 are a weak match, but together they're very strong, because what are the probability of 4 matches? And of course, what the person forgot to do is account for all the searches that failed, all the features that he looked for, 100 features on the shoes and 100 features on the pants, and forgot to account for that. The issue in origins where this happens is looking at the market as the source. Again, a lot of retrospective matching there. We'll discuss that. Another thing that you see is that there's strong evidence on the other side that is just dismissed without any explanation. For example, in the chemical attacks in Syria, we actually have a video of the opposition on the night of the attack wearing gas masks, launching the exact type of rockets that were found in the target. And the people who support the other side just simply say that's fabricated. That's the fabricated video. And what they forget is that this is very rare. That's like very, very rare for someone to stage a video, take actors and create like a whole fake scene. There's a lot of manipulations in videos, but staging a whole scene is very, very rare. Here we have the Furey-Cleavage site insertion, something that is a very clear genetic manipulation in the genome of SARS-CoV-2, and the response is it's not impossible. There is a way for nature to do that, which is of course correct. I mean, random processes can generate everything, but the question is what is the likelihood, right? And the likelihood is very low for that to happen. Another thing is coincidences that are dismissed. In the murder case, we had a suspect which has a very rare disorder that she wants to kill random people, and she happens to live right next to the murder scene. And in COVID-19, that's the coincidence of the outbreak occurring next to a major coronavirus lab. So in both of these cases, later evidence has supported our conclusion. In Syria, it was about that video I talked about. So that was geolocated to actually been taken at the intersection of all the trajectories of the rockets that fell in Ghouta. And in the murder case, there was mitochondrial DNA that was initially dismissed because it was a 1 in 700 match, which by itself was enough, but never mind. And this was later found to be on the order of 1 to 100,000, 1 in 10,000s, and this order. That's basically closes the case. Amazingly, in both cases, the authorities still deny that they were wrong. West still believes this was a government attack, and while the convicted person in the murder case was released, the actual the much likelier suspect is still walking free. Okay, so what we will be covering in the next 3 sessions about lab leak. So we will start with the priors. We will find there that zoonosis is probably a more common cause for pandemics, but actually lab leaks are more frequent than people previously believed, and the recent advances in gain of function increase the pandemic risk. We will then look into the location, and we will of course see that Wuhan is a much more probable origin under the lab leak hypothesis due to the gain of function research going on there. Well, it's not especially interesting in zoonotic. Here below you can see how the probabilities progress as we add the evidence. So we start with a low probability because zoonosis is more likely, and then update due to location. Then we will look into the specific WIV activity, and we will see that this activity is exactly the kind of research that would produce SARS-CoV-2, bringing us to 97. We will look into the market. We will see that while the market is an early superspreader event, the evidence does not support it being the where patient zero, where the first infection happened. But it's still evidence for the other side, of course, so it does reduce the probability, just not by much. Next session, we will look into genetics. The genetics in SARS-CoV-2, and especially the specific way in which the furin cleavage site appears in the genome, are highly unlikely to occur in nature and are very natural for a lab manipulation. So that brings us close to certainty. And last, we will look into just kind of remaining evidence of the behavioral patterns of China and WIV. We'll look into missing evidence, which is something important that many people forget to do, is that you need to look at what evidence you would expect to see and don't have, and what's the statistical significance of that. So overall, this will support both hypotheses pretty equally, but because we have this self-control of accounting for our own mistakes, then the more when you add more uncertainty into the model, then it goes closer to the middle. So that reduces the probability, even though the evidence itself is pretty symmetrical. So that's going to be our last, our final number. So we will see in session 3. Just so you understand, we're not crazy. This is basically all probabilistic analysis of origins of COVID reach very similar numbers. It's as far as I know, there is no probabilistic analysis that looks at this and reached the opposite conclusion. Yeah, so let's go. Let's start. So we will be starting with a prior probability. I will give. I assume you all know it, but I'll go through this quickly. So the prior probability is the initial estimate of a hypothesis probability before examining the specific evidence of the case. So this is something that our methodology explicitly required to do in order to prevent the prosecutor's fallacy, the thing that I will now demonstrate. So we have this situation where your friend comes to you and tells you he just went to a routine exam and he got an HIV positive result. And then you look together online and you find this test is 99% accurate, meaning that it will tell 1 in 100 negative people that they are positive. Okay, so we ask people, how likely is your friend to be actually HIV positive? Most people will say 99% because that's the test, 99% accurate, 99% result. But in reality, you need to account for the prior probability of your friend having HIV positive. And since this was a routine exam, then he just has the background probability of being undiagnosed HIV positive, which is about 0.1%. So now we look. There are two paths in which we can reach the positive response. One is your friend is healthy. That's 99.9% of the cases. And then he was unlucky to get the 1% false. So that's about 1% of cases this will happen. Or he's actually he's actually HIV positive and the test worked. So that is 0.1%. Okay, so one thing happens 1% of the time, and one thing happens 0.1% of the time. So obviously the 1% occurrence happens 10 times more likely, meaning having a false positive, that's the larger occurrence, and the ratio is 10 to 1. So we started with 1,000 to 1, and now we're 10 to 1, but still most likely HIV negative. So this is basically what we will be doing. We will be looking at the odds, and every time we see evidence, we'll try to estimate how it affects both hypotheses, by how much it narrows each hypothesis, and that will be the new probability. Okay. Another way to talk about probability is this famous quote by Carl Sagan that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? So you need to give evidence that overcomes a low prior. So we will be looking at the two hypotheses, trying to look at historic data and estimate based on that what is the initial likelihood of zoonosis in lab leak. This is going to be a bit challenging for several reasons. One is that pandemics are rare, okay, as well as all lab leaks. So we don't have enough historical occurrences to make good statistics and get accurate priors. Lab leaks have limited documented cases. And there's also limited data on the emerging technologies in gain of function. So the whole area of genetic engineering is rapidly advancing. So it's an exponential area. So it's hard to estimate by how much it increases the risk of a pandemic from gain of function. So one thing to just quickly realize is that lab leaks happen. It's not rare. I mean, not very rare. A few interesting cases here. One is the 1979 anthrax, which is interesting because this was in the USSR. This was interesting because initially the government blamed meat consumption for the pandemic, and only after the USSR collapsed did they admit this was a lab leak. So just to keep in mind, when people say that it's unlikely that this will be covered up, anything like that, this has happened before. Another interesting case is SARS. So this is a very similar respiratory virus. That actually leaked 4 times, two of those times from the same lab, so 3 leaks overall. So yeah, definitely something that is a good prior for our case here.
Saar, can I ask you about the SARS leaks? Do you know which labs or what countries they were in that they leaked from?
Yeah, we'll see it in a minute.
Okay, thank you.
1977, a flu leak. That is interesting because that has caused many deaths, also especially among young people. So that is a significant event where lab leak has caused a lot of damage. I can ignore the rest for now. So you're here so let's start looking at comparing lab leak and spillovers. Excuse me 1 minute, I will move my snoring dog away. Okay, so we have, looking at SARS outbreaks specifically, we have 3 lab leaks and 3 known spillover events. This is, of course, the ones we know about. There could be many more spillover events. There could have been many more lab leaks. Hard to tell, but it is important to look at these 3 cases and have a feel that this is not that one of these is 100 times more likely, right? So these are the locations you asked about, and interestingly, they leaked from all BSL levels. So these are major flu pandemics. So we have 5 in recent century. Of course, flu comes every year, but mostly these are just recombinations of existing flus. These are new and important flu introductions. Looking at major epidemics, this is just basically we looked at a list of all epidemics filtered by 2,000 dead. So these are the main ones. We have the 1977 one here, so gives you again a feel for what this might look like. So those are like 3 anchors we can work with. Again, not very reliable, but gives you a ballpark. So next, we want to think about what is the impact of gain of function of this. So there's two things to consider here. One, first is none of the priors is a gain of function leak. These are leaks for other reasons. So that would, of course, be a reason to reduce the probability we use. On the other hand, gain of function is a rapidly growing field, which is specifically talking about introducing more contagious viruses, right? So this is exactly something that should increase the probability of a lab leak. So we're trying to look at that. So we couldn't find a good precise measures of the amount of gain of function work. We do have two proxies. One is looking at the price of genome editing technology. The other is looking at BSL-4 labs, which are a proxy for an indication for looking at highly dangerous pathogens. So looking at the first one in terms of affordability, so we have this mentioned by Ralph Barrick, who is studying coronaviruses. So he says he's very interested in the field. So he said this, talking here, the drop from 42,000 to 6,000. Here is a more accurate description of the costs. Writing DNA is in red here, gene synthesis in red. These are, note that all of these are logarithmic scales. Okay, we're talking about exponential growth. Increasing BSL-4 labs, also very rapid over time. It's important to understand that this is not something that happened in retrospect. People were concerned about gain of function well before this happened. Okay, so there was a 3-year ban on research on SARS, MERS, and influenza gain of function. Okay, so this is something that was known before. And looking more generally, humanity is not very good in assessing new technology risks. So the space shuttle program was estimated to fail once every 100,000. It happened twice in 136. Nuclear power, again, something that everyone was very well aware of the dangers, but still we do have failures and meltdowns. So trying to integrate all of that into numbers, which is what you try to do. So this gives you a first glimpse on how we work. So what we did is we took these 3 priors we used. One was based on SARS, 3 versus 3 cases, the flu 1 versus 4, and major pandemics 1 versus 8. H1 in the middle, you can see the ratio that is implied, the probability that is implied from that. We do give a low and high estimate for each one because, like we said, we're trying to always look at what mistakes we could be making, what assessments could be wrong, and this prevents us from reaching overconfident results. We do a geometric mean for that, and then we do just adjustment for gain of function. So on the low end, we do a reduction because the priors are not gain of function. On the high, we do an increase because gain of function is introducing new pathogens, possibly at a rate that is much higher than any laboratory incidents in the past. So these are weighted at 20-80-20, and this is where we are. Any questions so far? Should I move forward?
I wanted to dig into this
Sure.
calculation a little bit here, Saar, to understand kind of some of the sensitivity. So assuming that you looking through some of your other sources, there's hundreds or more estimated lab-acquired infections across U.S. facilities, Australian facilities, many other facilities. But you seem to be using numbers that are significantly higher than that in terms of the probability of a spillover event causing a pandemic. How do you calculate that, or how do you integrate those two pieces? Because they seem fairly different.
Okay, so you're saying like we're trying to compare the hundreds of known infections to the millions of zoonotic infection, right? That's the idea?
Or just that these numbers seem much higher than what would be if using some of the estimates from the other sources, there's a 1.5% chance per year of a lab acquired infection being generated by any BSL-4 lab. It seems these numbers seem significantly higher.
Okay, so this is for the entire world. This is not for one lab. Okay, so this is we're looking here at the history across the entire world. So these are all the labs together, and in the context of pandemic. Okay, we're saying, okay, given that we have a new pandemic happening, what's the probability that a lab is the source? So this is these are the estimates. Because it's very, very different. In a minute, I will also show an analysis like you suggesting about looking bottom up on the frequencies that will give like a sensitivity, a sanity check on this.
Okay, one other question here. So this also seems sensitive to like what counts as a pandemic, and I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. And so in a sense, and I had asked this question a little bit in the email, but there's a lot of other diseases that people might consider, emergent or pandemic that are bacterial, Clostridium difficile infection, just to take one. So it seems like depending on that conclusion, you might be able to reduce the probability of a lab leak given you've seen a pandemic by 2 orders of magnitude by counting other things that kill a bunch of people that are bacterial diseases or, parasitic, for instance. So basically you're saying, how did you choose the 200K threshold, and why is that a reasonable threshold to anchor to?
So the 200 was simply at the point where you start to have a lot of pandemics, so the information starts to be hard to process. You can put different numbers. I mean, this is not going to be a huge difference in the final result. First of all, because you have a geometric mean here. And second, because, so if it will be 1 versus 5 or 1 versus 12, this is not going to be a dramatic difference. Maybe something important to say, once we get to session 3, we will be talking about numbers. The probabilistic power that would need to be overcome in order to claim zoonosis is about 100,000. Okay, so anything that is going to be about, okay, this should be 10 and not 23, we can simply grant it. It's not going to change anything in the grant thing. In order to have our analysis support zoonosis, you will need to show some crazy strong evidence. So basically anything that is about, okay, let's make these numbers a bit smaller, 2 times smaller, I'm fine with that. It's not going to change. But I agree that there's a lot of uncertainty. That's what I said when we started, that there's a lot of challenges in estimating priors here. There can definitely be the opposite claim that given what's going on with gain of function, that a new pandemic is 90% to be from that. So, there's a lot of uncertainty here. This seems to be something that's reasonable. Having no update in the impartial numbers for gain of function growth, I think, is very conservative. That is only because we don't have priors for that. In general, what we call here impartial in practice is a lot of these numbers are very conservative. We're doing this just in order to try to avoid getting into nitpicking, and because we don't need that, because the evidential power is so strong that we just try to put numbers that would be easy to agree on. Okay, next we'll be looking at a location.
Speaking of nitpicking, that's a typo. It's supposed to say 1 verse 7, not 1 verse 8.
No, I think it was 8. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You are correct. So
Okay.
that's
Your numbers are 1 verse 7. You just put on the side 1 verse 8. Okay. That was definitely nitpicking.
Oh, thank you.
All right, thank you.
That's good. Okay. Okay, location. So this, as far as you know, this has started at Wuhan, and we have a few questions we want to answer. First, how likely is Wuhan to be a zoonotic epicenter, given its location, bat populations? Another question is, how unique is the gain of function research being done in WAV, right? Because this is something that a lot of people forget to think about. So they're told this happened right next to a coronavirus lab. Okay, but maybe coronavirus labs are like in every city, right? So that makes it insignificant. So identifying how unique is the researcher is important. And what is the bottom line here? So let's dig in. So we're going to start about thinking what is the what is the probability under the zoonotic hypothesis. So East Asia is a home to a diverse distribution of bat species. That's where SARS originated. MERS, on the other hand, originated in the Middle East. There's some diversity of bats there and in Africa, but we'll be focusing on East Asia now. Again, a conservative approach. So we will only focus on East Asia, and we will only focus on cities, urban population in East Asia. So what we did is we went over basically all the countries you see here. Some of them, like India, got 50% because some of it seems to be low likelihood, and we got a total of 1.6 billion urban population. Wuhan is 12.3. For each country, we looked at the percent of urban population. 12.3 for Wuhan. We divide, and then following feedback from Peter, we actually added another 2x for Wuhan being a large city because indeed it makes sense that density is important. So calculating, we get 1.48% that Wuhan, if we're hearing about a new bat pandemic, Wuhan being the zoonotic source is 1.48. Peter in his presentation raised several reasons why Hubei is probably more likely. We need to see actual objective measurements. I mean, this is all very retrospective views. I mean, seeing that in the past they didn't ban wildlife trade for a while. I mean, we need to see how this happens in all provinces in order to claim that Hubei is in any way unique. And of course, another thing to note here is that many countries outside China are very likely to be the source. So that's something that was also neglected in Peter's calculation, is that we need to account for other countries. It doesn't have to be China. Just note that we didn't underestimate Wuhan because it's farther from the places. We just said it's around the place. So again, a conservative estimate. Okay, under the lab leak hypothesis, so Wuhan has WAV. That's the second largest lab for coronaviruses. The biggest lab is in North Carolina, which is much more significant. WAV regularly collect coronaviruses and conduct gain of function research. These two are basically the largest labs. We give WAV 20% of the world coronavirus gain of function. There's been a lot of reports that there's safety issues with WAV. We didn't dig into that because that would require looking at whether that is significantly higher than other labs. So we're just ignoring that. What is important is that at what level was coronavirus gain of function research being done. So these are the virus BSL, the safety levels for labs, 1, 2, 3, 4. SARS and MERS usually require BSL-3. WIV head up to BSL-4. And it turns out that the gain of function research on coronavirus was done in BSL-2. So the sources for that is we see it here in the website. They describe each pathogen, what BSL it is. You can see here from the leaked emails from the Freedom of Information Act, you can see here how virologists responded to hearing that this is done in BSL-2 lab, Wild West. Here is Xi Jinping, who's heading this research in WIV, saying they did BSL-2 and BSL-3. Here is a specific gain of function study done under BSL-2 conditions. This is by far much more troubling than anything else. Something to understand about BSL-2. So if you see the little cute guy here, he does not have any protection on his respiratory tract. You can go to YouTube and look for BSL-2 labs guidelines. You will see no masks as long as you look before 2020, right? After 2020, everyone started putting masks. But prior to that, BSL-2 lab is no mask. Here for BSL-3 you have full head coverage and respirator, and BSL-4 is a full body cover. Okay, so people playing with SARS-2 under BSL-2 lab, one could say this is a guarantee of infection. Okay, so let's update our numbers. This is where we left last time. 1.48 is what we said for zoonosis. 20% is what we said for lab leak. We gave 10 and 30 because we don't have enough confidence on how much other gain of function work was being done in other labs. We're giving a very mild update for BSL-2. I mean, this could easily be claimed to be a 20 factor. So we're giving it 4 and 2 for the conservative. Updating, this is our new number. Any questions at this point?
I'm still looking at your summary of probabilities. Sorry, what does the adjust for BSL-2 line mean?
Okay, so here you have the base factor by how much we will be increasing the odds for lab leak. So this is basically the ratio between the conditional probabilities, right? This is the conditional probability of the location being Wuhan under zoonosis. This is the conditional probability of the location being Wuhan under lab leak. So the ratio between them is how much you're going to increase your odds. And for BSL-2, we don't go for the conditional probabilities directly. We just say this is another increase of 4x.
I mean, but what is that coming from? Does it have to do with, you're talking about lab safety questions? You're saying that?
Yeah. So this is the fact that if we're talking about lab leak, then these people were handling SARS-2 in BSL-2, basically not protecting their respiratory tract. That's
okay. I might dive into more of that later. Thank you.
Okay. Next, we will be looking at specific activities in 2019 and overall and in WAV. So foreign cleavage sites were a hot topic. They were gradually being recognized as an important feature in the infectiousness of activity of viruses. You can see here some studies mentions. Won't go over all of them. Very important is the diffuse proposal, which we'll be discussing in detail next session. So this is a grant proposal by WIV and North Carolina and EcoHealth Alliance, asking for, I think, $50 million in order to study bad coronaviruses. Specifically, it included a gain of function section, which had these 3 features. One is looking for human ACE2 binding. Another is introducing human cleavage sites if they don't exist, and experimenting with glycans. Again, will be discussed next session. All of these exist in SARS-2. Okay, so this match is also very suspicious. So we're adding here the probability of all of these happening. Okay, so the probability of so let me explain what we do here. So if we're talking about gain of function, then it's very likely that this will happen, that this will match the kind of work that was interesting to virologists at the time. And now we need to estimate what is the best explanation under zoonosis. Okay, so why would these features all happen in this new pandemic if it's not from a lab? So for the FCS, we say, okay, this is what enabled the jump. So we're not giving it a very high update because it's still an update because it could be other features that will enable the jump to humans. But let's give FCS that is what caused it to be a pandemic, right? So something needs to happen in order for this to be not just any virus. So that's why FCS is not that strong. And for ACE2, the question is, why would a virus jumping from nature be so well adapted to human ACE2? That is pretty weird. We will discuss in more detail next session, but that's pretty suspicious. And glycans discussed next session, also a small update. So so that's the update we have here, growing to 97. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take all the data we talked so far, and I'm going to put it in a different framework and see that it reaches a very similar number. Okay, and I think this one is much easier to understand. It's just not the way we usually do it. So perhaps this should have been the main focus, but it doesn't matter. You can use either one. So what we're going to do here is not going to talk about the ratios. We're going to discuss each one separately, estimating the frequency of emergence per year. So on zoonosis, we will look. We will try to estimate at what frequency we will have a bat coronavirus pandemic starting in Wuhan. Okay, this is our target, and we try to estimate its frequency. So for zoonosis, we have SARS and MERS, which did not cause a pandemic. We have HKU1, which is endemic but not lethal. So basically, we didn't have a bat coronavirus ever causing a pandemic, but let's generously give it once every 20 years, 5% a year. And we want it to happen in Wuhan. That's 1.5%, as discussed before. And this is your final number for zoonosis. Lab leak, let's look at the chain of causality. So what we're saying is the diffuse proposal got rejected. Don't know if I said that. So the proposal didn't happen, but it gives you a good indication of what virologists were interested in doing at the time. And we actually know that, we'll talk about it later, we know that North Carolina did do some of these activities. So it's very reasonable to assume WFV also did some of these activities. So we're giving it 40% that they started it. So according to the proposal, that means screening for human ACE2 match. We know today that there are viruses in nature that are identical to SARS-2 in terms of their ACE2 match. We know WFV had 180 viruses they collected and didn't publish. So we think it's pretty likely that they would find within this database a good ACE2 match, 50%. They would then optimize it for human infection, like adding an FCS if an FCS doesn't exist there. That's basically what it says, so it's going to happen. And then they're going to play with this thing in BSL2. So some would say that's 100% infection, but because it's hard to estimate, let's put 15%. And this is the rate of, and then it might still leak and not create a pandemic, or create a pandemic not in Wuhan. So that's another 40%. So you multiply that, you get a frequency of 1.2% per year. You normalize this, and this is your move. And this is, how do I make this thing go away? And you get a final number of 94%. Okay, so very, very similar to here, using a very different method.
So sorry, this is where perhaps it's better to ask my question, and I think I conflated two things before. So you have the stat here, given the infectivity, so conditioned on there being some sort of HAI, you have a 40% chance that would start a pandemic in Wuhan. I think what I'm asking you to compare is, given that some of your other slides, or given that some of the other data suggests that LAIs or lab acquired infections are much, much more common than routinely thought, yet most do not result in a pandemic. It seems like that estimate is orders of magnitude higher than what some of your other slides would suggest, and it seems like that would be...
Yeah, of course. So I'll explain. So we're talking about a specific process, which is described in diffuse, which is about looking for ACE2 matches, adding a furin cleavage site if needed, and checking the performance of this virus, right? So this is basically SARS-2. SARS-2 is a high ACE2 match with an FCS. This is what it is. So if you do that in a lab and the worker gets infected, then SARS-2 starts, right? Because we know how infectious SARS-2 is. Okay, so the whole idea of this analysis is to look at the causality chain, not thinking statistically about how often this happens, but specifically what are all the things that need to happen in order to reach the the final result of a pandemic, a bad coronavirus pandemic in Wuhan.
Right, but I think I want to focus on this just because it seems very important to the analysis, and I appreciate that there are other analyses. Like, it doesn't, like, this is not, were this not to be true, it is not, dispositive for the overall case. But I think a 40% likelihood of a pandemic, given the infectivity of it, I think that is what I'm questioning. For instance, in some of those initial initial slides that talked about lab-acquired infections, they talked about examples in the 70s through the early 2000s of smallpox leaking out of British labs, where there was a generally low level of background antibody protection, and smallpox has a much higher rate of infectivity than SARS, right? Like, its R naught is higher. So I think what I'm questioning is where that 40% comes from, given that we have evidence of that you cite of higher infectivity strains coming out of a lab but not starting a pandemic.
I'll have to look at the smallpox cases. But basically the idea here is that we know how SARS-2 works. If I'm telling you I'm going to get a lab worker infected unknowingly, and he starts walking around with, playing with his family and friends and gym, I think we know what happens. We know what SARS-2 is. So
would it be fair?
That is how this works. But I will look into smallpox and see if I can understand why the discrepancy.
Okay.
Yeah. So now let's look at the other location aspect, and that is that the Huanan seafood market was the first super spread or large cluster identified. This is often the way you would often hear it in the probabilistic, like the intuitive probabilistic arguments, is to say, okay, Wuhan is a coincidence, but the market within Wuhan is another coincidence. So cancel those out, and you're left with the prior of most pandemics, starting with zoonosis. So what we'll try to show here is to show that this is a much weaker coincidence, and also in the next sessions we'll also discuss other evidence that supports on top of that lab leak. Okay, let's look at the probability under both hypotheses of Huanan happening. So the claim on the zoonosis is the market is one of very few places with live wildlife. It's the 1600th most visited place in Wuhan, so that's a huge coincidence that it has wildlife. There's an environmental sample that contained both raccoon dog DNA and SARS-2, indicating that raccoon dog brought it to the market. And there are positive environmental samples that appear to be near wildlife stalls. That is the gist of most of the claims around why the market is strong evidence for zoonosis. But of course, if it's not clear, wildlife is usually a good way for new viruses to get introduced to humans. So one thing that is very important to understand, that when we will be looking now at studies that try to pinpoint the market, is we need to be very careful with retrospective studies. Okay, if the saying goes, if you torture the data long enough, it will eventually confess to anything. So when you do extensive data analysis, you look into a lot of data, patterns will always emerge, just because the sheer volume of data and the searches you make. So in order to claim that there is any significance, you need to account for the scale of the search and the size of the search space. Only then is the finding significant. And we're going to see a lot of problems around this. This is known as the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, cherry picking, hindsight bias, p-hacking, multiple comparisons problems. It has many names in different fields. But the idea is that when you look for stuff in retrospect and look for something specific, you're much more likely to find it if you have a lot of data to play with. This is something that is, in forensics, this is known as junk science. This was an issue that got a lot of innocent people in jail. We talked before about the murder case we covered, in which they made a match from this mess of bloodstains to this shoe. The Dreyfus affair from 120 years ago also had the same issue about experts claiming that for a handwriting match, because they matched a few details and said that every weak match together creates a pattern. This thing was exposed by Henri Poincaré, which was a famous mathematician at the time. So that was one of the first cases where math was got into the court and affected forensics. Something that is especially risky is if the people doing these studies are motivated. Okay, because if there's the problem of people noticing patterns that aren't there. That's a huge issue. If they want certain patterns, that's much more risky. Now, it doesn't have to be malicious. It's just you just become much more happy when you see a pattern that you like. You want to invest more effort in that area. So what we see is that four of the authors of the main market study also wrote the proximal origin study from the beginning of the pandemic, and we now have a lot of internal emails between them. And I'll not go over all of it. I'm sure many people have already seen it. You see a lot of attempts to. They first of all, they recognize what this means to their field. They know that virologists really don't want that this would be blamed on virologists. They discuss how to present this to the press in a way that would divert them away from lab leak. We know that internally they initially suspected lab leak very strongly, but then when they went public, they presented it as some crazy conspiracy theory. Now they say they changed their mind given the evidence. That's fine. That's good science. But saying that people who think it are have some problem with their inference when they themselves thought it initially, that's of course very suspicious. So given that these are the people who are doing the study, and these are studies that are heavily based on pattern matching, this is something that if you want to have a robust probabilistic analysis, you just throw this away. This is something we will not consider if you want to do a serious result. Here we're doing a debate. I have to address any evidence that the opposition brings. But just so you understand, there is a study that claims a p-value of 1 in 10 million for genetic manipulation of SARS-2. We looked into this. We don't agree with the p-value, but we do agree with a lot of the statements there, and we tend to think it does show manipulation, but we don't use it at all because we know how risky it is. This is just not something that should be in a good analysis. So generally, what I would recommend, just ignore it. But because it's very hard to find in retrospect where all the bias is. Okay, it's hard when people present to you all the matches they found, it's very hard to go back and see what are all the things they looked at and didn't match. It's very hard for me to do that if I didn't have a camera in the room for the entire period. However, luckily, a lot of people did have the time to dig into this, and they found a lot of issues. So I will just point some of those out just to give a feel of how these studies look like. Okay, so one of the things is that until January 18, in order to be considered a COVID case, you needed to show connection to the market. Okay, so that's of course a big bias source. Another thing is that the whole Chinese health system was primed to look for new diseases with connection to markets. That's exactly how SARS-1 started, so everyone was looking to that, right? So when you have someone with unidentified pneumonia, okay, that's suspicious. When he works at the market, that's double suspicious. Okay, so you pay more attention to that. You can see here that there are from various sources, you see that there are 90 cases that don't appear in the final cases that were reported that on which this study was based on. We see that early cases were not connected to the market. You can see it here, all the blue cases. Okay, which is, as we'll see later, that is fairly not what you expect to see if the market is the first outbreak location. And something important to understand: the whole early cases here are unreliable. Okay, there is first of all, because this is a disease with a relatively low lethality, so a lot of people just were sick and no one knew about it. And the other is there is no published effort to contact trace or find the earliest cases. So maybe there is, but it wasn't published. Okay, so there wasn't really a good effort to try and find patient zero. This by itself is evidence of a lab leak because that probably means they started and found something they didn't like, but it's hard to say. But in general, you need to keep in mind that all the early cases, very noisy, very partial information, any conclusions gleaned for it is very low confidence. So this is, we see that the early patients are visitors rather than vendors. I accept, so Peter has responded to that saying that they are not like proper visitors. We will concede that. This is not a very important point for us. We have one case, Mr. Chen. Some say 8 December, some say 16. Let's assume 16. He lives nowhere close to the market, 30 kilometers away. He didn't mention any connection to the market. And the important thing here, he was diagnosed only because he has a relative that works in the Wuhan Central. Okay? And these are the hospitals in the city center are the ones that have the abilities to notice new diseases, to do genetic sequencing. The local clinics, they don't do that. They don't keep records as well as others. So the fact that we have this one case that no one has been able to connect to the market tells you that there are probably a lot of cases around the city. Now, when we say a lot of cases, I don't mean 10,000. I mean there are maybe 100 cases, maybe 200 cases around the city when the market started being noticed. Okay, another bias they did is they used social check-in data in order to estimate traffic. Of course, people don't really check in to a seafood market. It's not a very cool place. Also, it's generally an elderly population, so this is a very biased source to claim traffic. And we actually know the traffic. It's 10,000 visitors a day. It's a fairly busy place. We'll see later how this merges into the calculations. So another important thing is the environmental samples. So these were initially said to have that many positive samples are associated with wildlife stalls. Once they corrected it to look only at the positive ratio, which is what you see here below, you see that this corner is the hotspot, not really the stalls. And this corner, as you will see later, has a Mahjong hall, which is a much likelier place to generate these samples. Another thing is that when you look at the cases, rather than environmental samples, they're pretty spread all over the place. Okay, it's hard to see here a very strong pattern, other than maybe the west side being more infected than the east side. So this tells you that there's something else infecting these vendors rather than something that happened here. Later on, we will speculate that this is the Mahjong hall where the vendors went at the end of the day to play and socialize. So of course they come from all over the market, right? So you're not more likely to come to the Mahjong hall because your stall is next to it. You will come from anywhere you want, and then the infection spreads relatively evenly around the market.
To be clear, the Mahjong hall, it was not a place that visitors to the market went to. It was only people who worked.
No, I think you had visitors as well, but of course the locals would be much more likely to be there.
Okay, thank you.
So another thing that is a big, for a while was a big claim, but I think has now died out, was the claim that genetic genome analysis of samples has found the raccoon dog to be the source. This was again retrospective. This was hindsight bias. They looked for the raccoon dog and found positive samples, but in practice, the number of SARS2 reads was very low. And when you compare it to all the other animals, raccoon dog is actually negatively correlated, right? So you can see here, depending on where you look, whatever there's two types of correlations, you always see the raccoon dog is actually very low. And the high animals are humans and cow, sheep. So this is probably just the kind of meat that was sold by people in the stalls. So when you look at the correlation, when you look unbiased and the data that is unbiased, you see that there's nothing that points to wildlife being the source. And a very important thing, even if somehow we would find an infected raccoon dog and no wild animal was found positive in the market, even if we did, that doesn't mean that it's the source, right? It could very easily be infected by a human. Looking here through environmental samples, again, no correlation in wildlife. Lineages. So that's an important thing. So the market is basically dominated by lineage B, which has 2 mutations away from bat compared to lineage A. That's not what you'd expect. You'd expect to see an ancestral strain with less mutations compared to the origin. This is a very complex issue. We will discuss next session. But in general, at this point, we do not agree that lineage A has been introduced later. We believe it was introduced earlier, and the market, the first infection in the market happened to be lineage B, and that was amplified. More things. So as you've seen, there's been this attempt to show how cases pinpoint, like the average of cases is exactly at the market, which by itself is very suspicious because a city is not, people are not ants doing random walks. There's the flow of the city, there's the density. It's very weird that you would get the 1% probability contour falling exactly on the market. That smells a lot like p hacking. But anyway, you have, of course, you all recall that diagram. When you look at unbiased data, for example, these are Weibo cases. You see that they basically just match the population density. Okay, this little circle here is the center of population density in Wuhan, and you see it is much closer than the market. By the way, in general, the market is very close to the population center, right? So a lot of things that seem like they concentrated the market are just due to population density. So let's go on. Again, something to note about how the studies look biased. Here, when they do all this pinpointing, they show the center of one population. But when they used this data, they didn't show the population center. So, in general, this looks like not objective analysis. Just an anecdote: if you look at the Weibo early cases, then they center around WIV. Just to be clear, we don't claim this as evidence because we don't even expect WIV to be the center. If there's a lab leak, we'd expect it to be some place that the lab worker frequents after work. But it just shows you how easy it is to manipulate data to show what you want. Another unbiased source is pneumonia deaths and all-cause mortality. What you see here is the red areas are when it is statistically significant. Okay, once you have a statistically significant increase in deaths, then that's marked in red. In general, it just looks pretty random. Pneumonia is on the west side. All-cause mortality is on the east side. Nothing here that looks especially interesting to the market. Same thing when you look at seropositivity. So this is the market. What you see here is the seropositivity in April. Note that seropositivity in April is pretty good indication because Wuhan went into lockdown on 23 January. Okay, so at this point on, you don't have any more spreading that is, so the spreading is local, within families, buildings, stuff like that. You don't have spreading outside the districts. So April seropositivity is a pretty good indication of what was going on early in the pandemic. And basically what you see here is that the more crowded, the higher the density, then the more seropositivity is. But actually, for the market, it's lower than the neighboring. Okay, so these three are high density districts, but the market district is actually lower than the neighbors. No positive animals. And they also looked into a lot of suppliers of the market. So another thing we will do here is we'll try to compare it to SARS, to two other outbreaks in the market. One is SARS outbreak, and the other is Chinfadi outbreak, which is another SARS-2. So SARS-1, we had 9 out of 23 other animal vendors were positive for SARS-1. We don't have that for SARS-2. SARS-1, we have multiple locations outbreaks, also a restaurant that had wildlife. SARS-2, everything is traced back to Wuhan. Here you can see how SARS infections look over time. There's local infections that die out in many places until you get the big outbreak. So again, that's how zoonosis looks like, right? You have the animals all over the place every time infecting someone else. And now we'll compare it to another market outbreak. So the next outbreak after lockdowns in China was Chinfadi market. So it was also a market, even though we know it's not zoonosis because the virus was traced to Europe. Okay, so we know it's a human that brought it there. And both of these outbreaks lasted for a month, so they're a good comparison. So they give us a good reference point. So one thing is that if you look how many of the infected people were connected to the market, HSM pretty low, 33%, Chinfadi pretty high. Okay, so that's a good indication that the market is really the source. So when you have a much higher case count. Another thing is that if you look at how many of the direct exposure were actually vendors, you see similar numbers. So if it was wildlife, then you expect the vendors to be higher. We don't have that. We just see a normal distribution as you would expect from just a person bringing the virus in, rather than an animal infecting multiple vendors. In terms of environmental samples, so as Peter mentioned, there was the issue of the rain samples, which was claimed to be more indicative of animals. Happened in Chinfadi as well. And in general, the reason Chinfadi was this study hypothesized that the reason Chinfadi was the next outbreak after lockdowns is due to the conditions in the market. So we'll be discussing a bit later, and we will see that markets are actually a very good place for this to start. Okay, so what I'll try to do now is I'll try to probabilistically estimate whether. So there's no contention that the market is the first cluster noticed. That's not the issue. The question is, was it noticed because an animal brought it to the market or for some other reason? Okay, if it's zoonosis, it could be either an animal or another reason. I mean, it could be zoonosis and still the market not be the first location. It's still possible, right? It doesn't have to be that. So zoonosis, you have both options. In lab leak, it has to be the other because there's no animal. So now we're just going to look at comparing other to animal and see how these look probabilistically. Okay, so this is going to be a bit advanced, so stay focused. Okay, so now what we want to do is estimate the probability that HSM would be noticed first if an animal brought it there. Okay, so first of all, we need to consider that HSM is only one place with wildlife. There are 3 other known markets. There could be illegal markets. There could be other places that in retrospect would be said, oh yeah, that's a wildlife location. For example, restaurants holding wildlife. This is one of the SARS-1 spillovers wasn't a restaurant. So, I mean, today nobody talks about restaurants, but if it was a restaurant, everyone would be saying, oh, look, it's exactly like SARS-1. Traditional Chinese medicine hospitals could also hold wildlife, maybe other places we don't think about. So HSM is not necessarily as unique as it's made to be. We give it 50%. If there's an animal bringing the disease to Wuhan, we give it 50% and conservatively 30%. So these are pretty high estimates. I think it's hard to say HSM is responsible for more than 10%, but we'll go with this. So here we have the issue of no animal vendors infected. So we need to think, what is the best explanation for that? How do we steelman zoonosis for this evidence? So what we're saying is there's only a single infected animal, right? So instead of it being like SARS, where there were a lot of animals, there's only in one animal that was actually brought, or very, very few that were brought, and its vendor happened not to be infected. So this is pretty low probability, but again, we'll give it something reasonable. Then we have all the issue about the testing not working, the raccoon dogs being negative, the vendors being evenly distributed and not close to the stalls, no animals in the farms that feed the market being positive. So since we already assumed it was a single animal, and we need to be careful not to double count. We already assumed this is a single animal, then we can say, okay, it's pretty easy for the traces to be lost, so we give it 40 to 60%. Next, the fact that all the infections are lineage B, that is weird. So even if you have one animal and it infects someone, why does outside the market have the ancestral lineage, right? So we think the best explanation is that it infected 2 people. One of them was a visitor that went and spread it outside the market, and the other one introduced 2 mutations and then infected the market. Pretty low probability, but that's the best explanation we can come up with, 20 to 30%. The fact that when you use biased data, it's centered on the market, but unbiased isn't. So generally, we're saying that it's not. The modern city introduces a lot of noise into locations, so you don't necessarily have to see everything centered on the market. So we give it 50 to 100%, so pretty weak evidence. We don't give it a lot of weight. The fact that we have a lot of cases that are not associated with the market, which is unlike what we see in Shinfadi, the fact that we have Chen that is far away from the market. What we see here is we're claiming that the lineage B infection happened a bit later, so lineage A outside the market spread a bit faster. Again, weird, but could happen, 30 to 50%. And last is the fact that in this market, we also happen to have a very good indication of another reason why it would be a super spreader location, right? Because we have this Mahjong hall, which is an ideal, we'll talk about it in a minute. And the Mahjong hall is exactly where the highest positivity environmental samples are. So again, weird coincidence, 30 to 40%. So we multiply all of that, we get a very low probability on the mid estimates, and on the conservative estimates, 0.27%. Now, again, remember, this is us trying to stillman that. We think what we show here is a much better explanation than what zoonosis supporters say, meaning that this was like SARS-1, where you had a lot of animals, but somehow you didn't find anyone, and it didn't affect any of the vendors, and you have 2 lineages, with the one that's ancestral actually being the later one, and so all of this I think our explanation is much better and is a high probability, and that's what we always try to do. We always try to find the highest probability possible. Now we need to do the same for the other hypothesis. So what's the probability that HSM would be noticed without wildlife? Okay, so we know it's 10,000 people a day visiting there. That's 0.1% of the population. We say, okay, maybe people visit 2 places a day, so 0.05%. And then we look at something very interesting. So the market has several features that make it very likely to be a superspreader location or a big cluster. One, it has high traffic. So you have people that can bring the virus in. Okay, so that's already accounted for in the previous. And you have permanent residents. Okay, so if you think about the train station, for example, lots of traffic, but it can never become a superspreader location because there's nothing to keep the virus in and start amplifying it, right? So the idea is that when you have permanent residents that keep interacting, is that within this small population, you have a growth in the percent infected that is much higher than the entire city, right? So the entire city, they interact. Initially, it's very rare for you to find another infected person and get infected. But if you're inside the market, within a week, you have like 10 times more people to infect you. And after 2 weeks, you have 100 times more people to infect you. So very, very fast, this closed environment grows exponentially, right? So this is something that is very important for a superspreader location is to have both traffic and both permanent residents. And then, of course, if you have an enclosed environment, poor ventilation, humidity, all of these are another factor. Very few places have all 3 of these. And again, remember how in Shinfadi this is what we have, right? So in another sample of 1, it happened to be a market again, even though it's not zoonosis. So to give a feel for that, what we did is we just went to the data that gives the 20 top locations, and we based on whiteboard check-ins and seen what they are. And most of them cannot be a superspreader location. Transportation hubs, outdoor shopping, universities have the issue of young population. So very few places can actually have all these things. Okay, so we give it a 10x. Probably has to be much higher, and 4x conservatively. And the last thing is about the bias of the health system. Now, this is the thing that has been the focus of most of the discussion, but it's not that important to us. Okay, basically we're saying that the fact that it's an older population, more likely to hospitalize, and the fact that top-tier hospitals are next to the market and therefore more likely to notice that, the fact that there's priming to looking for market cases from SARS-1, we only give this an x2 into x4. Okay, so this is basically saying another way to explain this is we're saying that there are another 1 to 3 superspreader locations in Wuhan at the same time, but they weren't noticed as fast. And once they were noticed, they were just lumped in with the whole Wuhan being infected, right? So people didn't notice in retrospect that this was an early superspreader location. But this is all we give it. It's just x4, x2. So we're fine with saying that HSM was the only superspreader location. Okay, we find throwing away all the biases we talked about and just saying, yeah, it happened by chance to be the only superspreader location. And what we see is still that makes the other explanation more likely, right? Because here we have 4% to 0.4%, or it's 1% and 0.2% if we ignore this last thing. And here we had much smaller numbers, okay? So still, even with all the coincidence here, the fact that the evidence is so against the market makes it more likely that even if it was zoonosis, we should prefer to say that this wasn't where it all started. Okay, and once you say that under zoonosis, another lab leak, we're using the same best explanation, then the market means nothing. Then the base factor is 1 because they both have the same explanation and there's nothing else. This is an important and complex point. I will probably discuss it a bit more in the rebuttals. Um, Two things less important. These are like kind of backups. So since the HSM had a Mahjong call, this could definitely be how this virus first got introduced into the market, right? So these Mahjong rooms are perfect. They have everything you need for a virus to spread. So you could say that what happened is that the patient 0, which we say is a lab worker, went to Mahjong, or a friend of his went to a Mahjong room, and from there it spread through Mahjong rooms and eventually went to the HSM, which was noticed early due to the bias from SARS-1 and proximity to top-tier hospitals. So this is a very good explanation that we think is better than an animal. What you see is you have lots of testimonies that Mahjong players were the first cases. Okay, you can look at these later. We have the issue of the Mahjong hall being exactly where the highest positivity rate is. And so it benefits the evidence. I mean, you have the high positivity rate, you have the fact that the vendor cases are distributed evenly, which is what we saw. So environmental samples close to the market, close to the Mahjong hall. Vendor cases distributed evenly, which is basically the vendors that like to play Mahjong. There's no reason for them to be concentrated in any place. And it accounts for all the evidence against the wildlife, the lineages, the reverse correlation, seropositivity, everything that goes against the market is well explained by the Mahjong Hall's hypothesis. So this is something to consider. This is not what we're claiming. It's just a backup claim we can take if for some reason we do want to say that patient 0 was if we do want to claim that HSM was the only superspreader location. And as the last line of defense, we can still go to 1 CDC, which is very close. It's like it's a very weird coincidence how close the 1 CDC is to the market. The thing is that 2nd of December they moved to this new location. That means that in the weeks before there was a lot of movement of equipment, people, perhaps interacting with WIV, changing of equipment. There's a lot of ways where during that move, an infected lab worker from WIV could infect someone from CDC, and from there it will get to the market. But again, this is like just a very, this is not our main hypothesis, it's just a backup hypothesis showing that even if for some reason the market turns out to be interesting, there are still good explanations under lab leak. So here we're just summing up all the expectations versus reality. There are these patients, the infected animals that are missing, the infected vendors that are missing, the infection rate was highest among vegetable vendors and not animal vendors. The lineages, so all the things don't match our expectations. So basically, at this point, what we do is we ignore the market. So basically, we're saying that the market is the best explanation under both hypotheses, so it doesn't change much. I think I made the wrong copy here. Under the low, I think I did a 0.5% reduction. I need to fix this. So this is our final number for session 1 before we go into genetics.
Can you clarify what it is on the side you wanted changed?
We're supposed to have a line here for the market. So if basically our conclusion was that the market is not the best explanation. Sorry, that an animal is not the best explanation for why the market is noticed. So if that's not the best explanation, then you're using the best explanation, the same best explanation both for the lab leak and for the zoonosis, right? In both cases, we're saying the reason the market was noticed first was for reasons not related to the animal, because of how it's built, the population, Mahjong hall, lineages, anything. So the evidence points to the market not being where patient 0 was. So that is the case on both hypotheses. So since both hypotheses claim the same thing, there's no base factor, there's no update. Still, I think we did a 0.5 update here. I just I think I cut the spreadsheet too high, and this would be the new number.
Can you just tell me what the numbers that got cut off were? Or I guess you'll probably send us the written.
I will.
It's not important, but I'd like to know.
I have it in front of me. Yes. So market. Yeah. So it's 0.5 for 0.5 for market and the low, and 1 for the others.
Okay, and that is after total WIV activity.
Yeah.
And is that accounted for and updated, or is that missing in the updated row? Is the 0.5?
So this is what we had before.
Okay.
So we were at 97, and now we're at 95 due to the market.
I see. Thank you. Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. Sorry, excellent. We'll take another 7-minute break and then begin the rebuttals.
Maybe 10.
10 is okay?
Yeah, all right.
For you?
Thank you for the presentation.